sometimes the differences that we have, what we often refer to as as intercultural differences, are often just misunderstandings. These are layers that we've placed over ourselves in our understanding of one another that are often incorrect, that are often misunderstood. And if we can peel off those layers and really get to what is at the bottom of who we really are, we start discovering that we're all very similar.
Welcome to the Cultural Agility Podcast, where we explore the stories of some of the most advanced intercultural practitioners from around the world to help you become culturally agile and succeed in today's culturally complex world. I'm your host, Marco Blankenberg, International Director of KnowledgeWorks, where every day we help individuals and companies achieve relational success in that same complex world. Welcome to today's podcast. Today is a special recording because I'm with a friend, colleague, fellow consultant, fellow facilitator, and we've had the chance to work together on and off for the last more than 20 years, I think it is, George. I don't remember exactly when we first met, but it's over 20 years ago now.
Indeed.
So it's wonderful to have you on this episode to talk about the world of consulting, the world of global consulting, intercultural consulting. I think it's a fascinating subject, and there are so many lessons that you have learned that I believe are worthy of passing on to our audience today. So thank you for joining.
It is a pleasure. Thank you, Marco. I've been looking forward to this opportunity to spend some time with you this afternoon. Yes.
So, George, you originally hail from South Africa. We met for the first time in the UAE, in Dubai, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So it'd be great if you can introduce yourself to our listeners today.
Thanks, Marco. Yeah, this is always an interesting one to introduce yourself in a few seconds, which is a tough one, but I'll try. As you mentioned, Marco, we met in the UAE, which was an important step in my life journey. As I originally, I come from South Africa, currently living in Cape Town, and spent my formative years in Johannesburg in the military. Then had the opportunity to move out to the Middle East and engage with KnowledgeWorks, get involved in some academia, be involved in the consulting industry. And I think over the years, I've been pretty much flowing in between the two. So having the opportunity to invest in individuals from an academic point of view, but then also to contribute to organizations and their success as a management consultant. So for the last 25 years, being involved in that flow and coming off a strong base of having spent about 8 years in the military as well, in the Navy. So I'm an ex-naval officer. And that's also, interestingly enough, it was the launching pad for me as an organizational consultant, particularly given many of the changes that the South African military was experiencing in the 90s that I was part of. In a nutshell, that's where I'm from and what I've done so far.
Now, coming from South Africa, some people call it the Rainbow Nation. Other people question that label. But being born and raised in South Africa, what were some of your earliest intercultural experiences growing up there?
Well, I think for every South African, that is different. It really depends on which area you're from, whether you grew up in a more rural context or whether it was in a more urban city life kind of environment. I had the opportunity of being involved in both, but I think probably my most important formative years were in my later teens, early adulthood, being involved as a university student in the change that was taking place in South Africa in the early 90s. I had the privilege of being involved in the youth movement of one of the unique political parties at the time called the Independent Party. And I remember being part of their first youth troop that had a trip down to Cape Town at the time. At the time, I was studying at the Rand Afrikaans University, which was a very traditional, National Socialist almost educational platform. And traveling to Cape Town and working with other youth, young adults, to start to think about what would the new South Africa look like and what role can we play as young South Africans in that new South Africa. And that was followed by a time in the military, and I think this is where my intercultural experience really started growing. In that, at the time, I happened to get involved into a process of integration of different armed forces. Now, as you would know from the past, South Africa has, in the past, was a deeply divided society, and sometimes, unfortunately, still is. So to answer your question about the Rainbow Nation, I think we would like to be, and I think many of us try and be, but often there are severe obstacles that needs to be surmounted, and we work hard to do so. And at that time, I think, was a good example where you had different armed forces, what was known in the past as the South African Defence Force, Umkhonto we Sizwe, that many might have heard of, the Pan-African National Congress. These were what we in those days would call non-statutory forces, or what many would have called at those days terrorist organizations that had to now integrate with various and very different cultures, different political agendas, highly racially fragmented and polarized. And I was involved at a time where individuals that were literally a few months earlier were facing one another over a barrel of a gun had to now suddenly start working together, sitting next to one another in the same office. And I think, following on from my experience at university, this was really a time where I had to start thinking about, well, in this place where there are so many people that are so different and but yet so similar, strangely enough. And the similarity started coming out when I was involved in a program that was called the Psychological Integration Program. So there is a very early form of ICI development that was taking place in South Africa. And the purpose of that program was to try and find common ground amongst all of these, culturally diverse individuals. And what we were trying to do, using various psychological techniques, was to create a platform where people could communicate. And it was so interesting. It was a week-long program. And during that week, you would visit different military bases. And, in some cases, there were, some of those military bases were located in highly volatile areas. I can think of one example not too far from where I live, where we ran a program in the Khayelitsha area, where the traditional, what was called the Cape Colored Corps, were located. I think, if I remember correctly, the 5th Infantry Division. And during this program, you had all sergeant majors that were either from Umkhonto we Sizwe or from the old SADF, sitting across one another at the table and literally wanting to tear one another's eyes out, in this conversation. And what was interesting enough, traditionally in the military, on a Wednesday afternoon, at least in the South African military, there's an opportunity for people to come together, to play sports, to step away from the office. And we used that Wednesday afternoon on the course to watch a copy of the recording of the 1995 World Cup that was just recently played. And of course, where South Africa won the final, which was a great event for bringing people together. And during this afternoon, it just seemed that all these differences, all this tension started disappearing. People started having a good time, started talking to one another. Obviously, infused by the excitement of having won the World Cup and being world champions. And I remember so vividly, sitting in that room opposite a guy who was recently the head of the chief of the South African Navy, at that stage a lieutenant, and him saying to me, George, actually, I don't know what all this, what all this tension, what all this unhappiness is all about that we're experiencing. Because he said to me, you and I are very similar. And I said, I agree, but you tell me, why do you say so? And he said to me, well, George, why are we here? We are here to earn a living. We are here to care for our families. We are here to have some purpose to our day. And all of this other stuff is just political rhetoric. And it was during those type of conversations that I think, the penny dropped for me that, sometimes the differences that we have, what we often refer to as, as intercultural differences, are often just misunderstandings. These are layers that we've placed over ourselves in our understanding of one another that are often incorrect, that are often misunderstood. And if we can peel off those layers and really get to what is at the bottom of who we really are, we start discovering that we're all very similar. And from that, that's that base of similarity, of shared interests, of shared purpose, really, one can then start building something that is unique. And it's something that leads to, people being able to work together productively, in harmony and in peace. And that really is, I would say that was the start of my intercultural journey. And what I've just seen growing from strength to strength since then.
That in and of itself is worth an episode or maybe even a book.
Amen.
So from there, we just fast track and you went into the GCC, the Gulf region, right, into the UAE, and that's where we eventually met. You had the opportunity to be part of some of the earliest groups of where we certify people on intercultural intelligence, or to become more culturally agile and train and coach others to do the same. What drew you into that? You know, the stories you just told, obviously, that's in the background, creating the groundswell. But what drew you into ICI, intercultural intelligence?
Marco, I've always been one that believes in method. And I believe, like old King Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. And we do have methodology for things in life, and it helps us make things easier. And I think what drew me into the whole, in those days, the ICI cultural agility, as we spoke about cultural agility in those days, arena was, the idea of having something that I can use to try and explain to others what I experienced when I was in Khayelitsha, right? And to put some form around that, and to apply psychometrics and other useful tools and methodology to make that applicable to others, for others to learn and to be able to apply in their everyday lives, whether that is in a normal relationship, or whether it is in trying to make an organizational practice work. So I think that's what drew me to the ICI model, or the ICI practice, was here is something that you were describing to me that was just immediately, just landed on me, that resonated with what I felt in my heart and in my soul as being real. And when I then overlaid that on my experience as a young South African in the military and in the Middle East, then it just makes so much sense. The concept of being able to correctly identify what you're seeing around you in terms of others, to be able to interpret that correctly, and then to be able to adapt to it. That's what I saw in Khayelitsha. And when you started explaining and describing ICI to me, I think it just made perfect sense. And that's when I got excited. I thought, well, this is something, if I can learn this and learn to apply this broadly, that would really empower my journey of wanting to help others, see this light that I think was starting to shine, in all aspects of my life, but also that I really knew and could understand was necessary in so many other contexts that I got involved in.
And it's fascinating how you draw those two together. On the one hand, there's the method, but there is also your own life experience And with hundreds of practitioners around the world, they have gone through the same experience of, hey, here's a methodology that makes culture accessible and it helps with sense making, but also it makes my own story come alive. It creates a lot of answers, especially the why answers, I think, of what we've gone through and why something worked and why something didn't work. But you already mentioned that it impacts relationships. How did it impact you? What did it do for you personally?
Well, I think, Marco, what you probably having, being married to a South African as well, that we can be quite stuck in our ways. We are, Afrikaner, Boere mense, as they say, and what I experienced in starting to develop as a culturally agile individual, as a cultural learner, as we would put it in those days, was that I was able to start shining some light onto different parts of my life and my behavior that I could identify still being stuck in a kind of a negative paradigm, right? And through applying some of this methodology, some of these thoughts that we had been playing around with at that time, I myself could really step back and say, hang on, George, you're talking about being interculturally intelligent. You're talking about being someone that others can work with. But, in this specific area of your life, is this something that really supports that? Or is it something that you need to be thinking about and really interpreting correctly yourself in terms of how you're behaving before you can impose yourself on others? Because as you probably know from working with me, Marco, I can be a bit of a control freak sometimes.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that idea of you can teach a method, but if that method doesn't come alive for you from the inside out, then you almost lose your credibility.
Yeah, no, I think this is very important in the sense that, and maybe if we get the opportunity later to talk a little bit about just consulting practice in general, I think it really comes to the really heart of how do we make consulting practice work? Because I think there are so many methods and so many consulting solutions out there, and coming and having spent many years within the large big four consulting firms with exposure to the strategy firms and the boutique firms, there are so many solutions, and so many of those solutions we try and implement, as is within a new context, such as the Middle East, for example, GCC. And then we step away and think, oh, why doesn't this work? But I think, and this is really something that I learned as I started to get involved with you from an ICI perspective, is that, it's almost as if we're trying to put a square peg in a round, in a round hole. In that, the round hole of the way in which maybe an individual operates within an anonymous environment, forced into a square peg of a guilt innocence consulting solution. It just creates friction, as opposed to lasting solutions and lasting value to our clients.
Yeah, and it seems you're raising, in essence, two issues here. One is, does global best practice really exist? Because there's lots of square pegs in round holes where there's universally applicable best practice. And then the other thing is, how can consultants move in and out of different cultural contexts, work with people from very different backgrounds? Wouldn't they get lost if they don't have just one method to work with? So what's the classical consulting? We cook up a methodology and we sow that methodology all around the world, versus a more culturally agile consultant. How would you describe the difference?
I think the difference is very much one of what is the purpose of what you're trying to do. I remember us often having this conversation as colleagues, and you asking me, well, George, unto what are we doing this? And I think that is crucial in your consulting approach, is why are you doing this? Are you doing this to merely implement some methodology that was published somewhere? or are you doing this to really help someone to make a lasting change? And while I do believe that there is definitely a wide body of established, recognized, and very valuable solutions out there, that a interculturally or culturally agile consultant really is one that is able to take that, put it in his or her back pocket, and then say, all right, I'm looking at the situation in front of me. What is it that I'm trying to achieve, and why am I trying to achieve this? So starting with the second question, why am I trying to achieve this? The answer needs to be in order to help the person that I'm dealing with, in order to solve their problem as best or in the best way that they can possibly do so themselves. Right? Answering the first question of how am I going to do this? Well, I need to bring this established solution that has been validated and replicated elsewhere. And I need to ask myself, well, how can I now put this into place so that it actually helps this client of mine to implement the solution effectively? And this is where I think cultural agility and intercultural intelligence comes in. So how do I help this individual? For example, and probably the best way to explain this is through a story. We were involved in a large implementation of a new strategy for the electricity generator in Kazakhstan a few years ago. And what we were trying to do was to support the corporatization process that this electricity generator, Kigog, I think it was called at the time, was trying to realize. And the purpose was for them to then engage fully in supplying energy to the EU, etc. So it was both a major corporatization process, but also a major culture change process. And at the time, Kazakhstan was still moving out of the old Soviet era, and a lot of the mindsets were still, old Soviet, large-scale, institutional, very slow moving, very traditional mindsets. And we had, markets that these guys now started having to compete with and engage in that were not only ambitious, but that were also very innovative and adaptable and agile. So changing the corporate environment within Kigog in order to play in this new market was quite a challenge. And I remember often at the time I was leading the change management work stream on this large initiative as part of one of the big four firms. And I remember often going to the board meetings where we now had to present some of our solutions that we were developing. And a part of our purpose was to support the CEO at the time, because he was ultimately responsible for making this work, right? And I don't know why, but probably because, I realized that in this environment, creating community was important. And I often, when I started my part of the presentation, I started off with a joke, right? And so we did a number of these board meetings, and at the penultimate board meeting, I made my presentation, and it didn't go so well that day. So the CEO afterwards said to me, "Well, George, what happened to the joke?" And so I said to him, "Well, my apologies, Mr. I think his name was Alexandrov. I apologize. I just, we were so caught up in the work, I forgot about the joke." He said, "No, George, but the joke was really important, because what you were telling them was really, it was very different to what they were used to, right? And diving into that solution, even though to you it was straightforward, and and you had all the best practice and the benchmarking, all that stuff ready, and a really good explanation of how to make this work, for them, these guys, just were not in the frame of mind to be able to absorb and accept what you were telling them. But by adding in this little piece of joke in the front, what you did is and he recognized, you were starting to develop some community, because we've done this before. So they now expected, George is going to come up, he's going to tell a bit of a joke, and then he's going to get into all this change management stuff, which is important for us to know, right? Without the joke, and it's a very simple thing, but without the joke, it was a lot more difficult for them to understand what I was going to try and tell them. By telling the joke up front, what I was doing is I was starting to build some community. And in that community, we could find one another. Many of the tensions of who's who in the zoo as far as the meeting is concerned, or who's right and who's wrong, all of that kind of moved away a little bit during the time while we were laughing about this ridiculous little joke that I might have inserted in my presentation. But very importantly, because I did that, it allowed for this methodology to work. And I think there are many other examples that I go into, but I mean, that's just one small way. I think that you as a culturally agile consultant can add things into the way in which you introduce best practice to make best practice work, even though you're not changing the practice at all. You're just changing the way in which you are delivering that practice.
Yeah, and what you're alluding to is really that idea that intercultural consulting is both 100% relational and 100% transactional. It's not just about the method, and the packaging is very much to do with how the people will respond to it.
Indeed.
Very often they quote unquote buy you as a person first before they're willing to embrace your method. And knowing how to do that in multiple contexts is so incredibly important, and also really hard to do because the lessons never stop, right?
Yep. And as you know, probably better than I do, using the approach that I've just explained doesn't work in all contexts, right?
Exactly.
I've been in other contexts, with organizations in Europe, for example, where that would have been seen as highly inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, there are other methods that one can use, to make that work.
You were instrumental in getting our intercultural consulting methodology documented, and we are still using that today. It has grown even after you moved on to bigger playing fields. It was in the beginning I was like, okay, is this, where is this going? And now looking back more than 20 years, I'm still forever grateful that you started that process. But to our audience, explain the for dummies version, so to speak. What is an interculturally intelligent consulting methodology? How is it different from, run-of-the-mill regular consulting, so to speak?
Right. Marco, I think what one needs, probably the easiest way to think about this is if you think about an ice cream, an ice cream cone, so you have this nice sugary cone and this nice big blob of gelato on top of it. That's consulting, right? And it's really attractive to many of our clients, especially when they're in trouble, because, here we come, we bring something that hopefully will be tasty, that their employees and their shareholders, etc., will eat up, and it'll help them to solve and some form of problem that they have. I think what interculturally intelligent consulting is really that, that sugar cone with a nice big blob of chocolate covering over it. All right. And what we do is, if you let's take, for example, a standard Big Four consulting process, right? Where you'll go into a situation, you'll do some form of pre-analysis, understand the current state, then apply some benchmarking in order to conduct a gap analysis, then develop a number of solutions, proposed solutions, whether those are solutions in terms of process, in terms of structure, in terms of technology. These days, very often technology, because of the whole development in agile technology, et cetera, and then some form of an implementation plan. And hopefully, if you're lucky, you can walk away before the implementation starts, because then it's not your problem if it doesn't work, right? So that's the traditional kind of 4-stage process that consultants typically use. I think what makes the ICI way of doing it differently is, if that's the ice cream and the ice cream cone, the chocolate is taking a step back, and during each of those different phases, applying a different lens, and then to say, right, as we do the current state analysis, right, what do we need to understand, not only about the organization, but also about the people within that organization, how they view the world, how they engage with life culturally. What do we need to understand about that, so that both we can both understand what they're all about, and very importantly, when we communicate to them what we found, that we communicate that in a way that that they can understand themselves. And when I say that, I mean not conceptually, but at a heart level, because often the issue is not knowing what I'm saying, it's feeling what I'm saying. Does it resonate with me, what you're trying to explain to me? It's not a case of does it make sense. Something can make sense perfectly, but if it doesn't resonate with you, it's not going to be something that you can implement or use, right? So I would say that's the major difference. And it sounds a superficial, very easy thing to do, but it's not. And I think some of the methodology that we've developed over the years really allows you to take a step back, apply that lens, and then apply best practices in a way that resonates with the heart, and therefore is easier to implement.
Now, in our network, we have a number of people.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have a number of people in our network who have actually said, I joined the ICI network because in some of the firms, I'm not relationally allowed to get involved with the client. Because everything, the chocolate on top of the ice cream is really very relational, right? So,
yep. It is.
It almost is a little bit counterculture within the consulting world.
It is, Marco. It is, and I've also often sat in many, not only meetings in planning large scale account engagements where we need to put strategies together to either win work or make large engagements successful. But even being involved over many years in the training of consultants with some of the big four firms, I had the privilege of running what we would call the basic consulting training courses or manager training courses, and even in those courses, being told, look, we are here to deliver methodology, to deliver solutions to our clients, but methodology is key. Right? So we are not here to adapt. We are here to bring these individuals or these organizations predefined solutions that work. But then throughout the conversation, as you start talking about experiences that many of my colleagues have had, then it always comes out that, you know what, actually I had to completely redesign and reimagine this solution that was given to me from our method set, because it had to, wasn't applicable to my client. And then I always stepped back and I said to myself, this is so sad, because as a firm, the big four, the strategy houses, they spend millions on developing methodology. And there is nothing wrong with that methodology. My take on this situation is that you don't have to adjust the methodology. You've got to be able to have the methodology resonate with the client, right? Let's take something classic, like, for example, the balanced scorecard, right? There's nothing wrong with the balanced scorecard. How can you, though, talk about the balanced scorecard to make sure that resonates with someone that is looking at it from a, what we would call a guilt innocence point of view, or mindset, which probably is easier because you've got all these different categories, these buckets of things that you measure, and you either measure up to it or you don't, right? More importantly, how do you make it resonate with someone that doesn't look at the world in terms of, buckets of things that I measure and that I measure up to or not, but rather that looks at the world in terms of groups of people that I relate to, that I need to either satisfy or honor. It's a completely different approach. So it's not about changing the methodology. It's about how do you take that methodology and talk that methodology through in a way that can resonate in the hearts of the clients. And I know this probably sounds very, touchy-feely to many of the hardcore consulting types, but it has to resonate. We always talk about resonating, but resonate with the heart of the client. Yeah.
Which also is linked to, having an impact that lasts. Because if that doesn't happen, I've seen time and time again, you walk away, you think you've had a successful project, but if you had the chance to revisit or hear, what has happened 3, 6, 12 months later, then it all has fizzled out. Because it wasn't really taken to heart by the client. Now, you had the chance to get into academia in the Gulf region. Actually, we had the chance as KnowledgeWorks to train over 5,500 Gulf nationals on cultural agility, which was a fantastic opportunity. You were embedded in the system, and
I was a spy.
In that way, you had the chance to work with people who come from a very different context. So, how, as a lecturer, as a researcher, were you able to use cultural agility to connect with your students, with their families, etc.?
Well, I think let me use I got a really interesting story to tell you in this regard. A number of years ago, and you would be aware of the study, there was something called the GLOBE project, right? So this was a study done many years ago looking at something called authentic leadership and what does that look like, in different parts of the world. So at the time, I was teaching leadership at the Dubai Men's College. And I thought, well, what a wonderful opportunity to expose my students to, different ways of thinking about leadership. And unfortunately, there was a gap in the study in that one of the countries that were not, or the regions that were not fully represented was the GCC. And I suggested to my students, let's do a study where we look at the different ways in which Emiratis describe and understand leadership. And I knew that there were different tribes within the federation. And I thought it would be really interesting to see, we use the same methodology, use the same questionnaire, etc. And they had to go out and speak to their families and find out, how do Emiratis view leadership? What does authentic leadership mean to them? And that, I discovered, was the biggest mistake ever. Because the first thing that happened during the conversation was not talking about, what does authentic leadership mean, but immediately the conversation was about who is Emirati. It was so funny because, you had different, as you know yourself, different tribes, and those tribes were obviously from different parts of the country and have been there for longer periods. And there were big arguments about now which of these tribes are really now Emirati tribes and not Emirati tribes. So scoping your sample here was really difficult because they couldn't agree who was in scope and who was not. But behind that story lies, I think, to me, one of the most important opportunities to apply intercultural intelligence. Because in that conversation, that started becoming highly, highly emotive, which you can imagine. It almost reminded me of the time in the military when I was involved in the integration in South Africa, where I now had these tribes sitting in front of me in the classroom, starting to almost wanting to get into fisticuffs about, are the guys from Al Ain, are they really Emiratis? Or the guys from Dubai? Or the guy from Abu Dhabi? And having to step back and use the process of intercultural intelligence that we've learned to get these guys to stop and say, all right, step back, right? So let's start and think about ourselves as participants in this classroom. Who are we? How do we behave and like to behave? How do we present ourselves? Who are we now dealing with in this classroom? Guys that are coming from some of those tribes in Al Ain, or some of these tribes on the wrong side of the highway in Dubai, as you would know, right? And how do we learn about one another so that we can have a very, peaceful and productive conversation about what is authentic leadership in an Emirati context? And it was really interesting because it took a while. It took about 3 weeks of sessions to get to that point where guys could really start trusting one another in order to talk about this very, very emotive topic, so that we can get to a solution in terms of what does authentic leadership look like in an Emirati context, and what can we learn about that, and how can we use that for the future for them in their careers as well as they practice their own leadership, within the government or other organizations that they would be working on. So that's just one example of and so it's not only about in the traditional sense, getting students to learn better, but it's also getting them to wanting to really at a deep level engage with one another in order to learn and to grow as young men and women.
Yeah, and I think the intercultural intelligence framework in two ways allows that to happen. And you illustrated it beautifully, that on the one hand, we are deeply connected to families, tribes, nations, but we're also unique. We have our own unique cultural story, our own unique cultural journey, and connecting with that. And the second thing is to actually have a neutral language to talk about it. So the language of the three colors of worldview is in and of itself a neutral language. There's no good or bad in it. The same with the 12 dimensions of culture. It's not that one way of doing things is better than another way of doing things. So that neutrality of the language really deepens the conversation. It reminds me of a project we ran in South Africa where coaching across ethnic groups was incredibly difficult, especially in the early days. And, a coaching conversation between, let's say, a Caucasian white South African and let's say, a Zulu South African would stop halfway, or would never really reach the level of depth you need for coaching. But then bringing the intercultural intelligence framework in, all of a sudden the conversations started to last longer. They went deeper. The coachees landed on profound ways that they wanted to move forward because of the neutrality of the language that we use. Now, for you to continue after your even academia, you got headhunted once again into the Big Four space. When you think about the world of consulting, you now have a unique opportunity, really, in your PhD work, to develop a method, right?
Yeah.
but a more culturally agile method. So talk to us about that.
Thank you, Marco. Yes, at a fairly late stage in my life, I decided to really go back into academia, and I think, in many of the conversations that even you and I think, Marco, over the last few years have had with clients, we've realized that it's really important to put that, the academics and the practice together. And in talking to so many of my academic colleagues, one of the challenges that we have in academia is to really try and bring, the ivory tower of academia and the dirty roadside practice of doing things in real life together. And that's not always that easy. Now, there are very good examples of where that is currently being done very, very well. But I think often the issue is that some of the theoretical or the theories that are being put into place are being developed in an ivory tower, in an environment where maybe the sample sizes are only other students available at the university, or we're looking at very specific case studies that are not, generalizable, etc., etc. And specifically in an area where I am very interested in, and that is bringing about change. And I think something that is core to what Knowledge Works does is this idea of positive behavioral change in people, right? Whatever that means for the person that is involved in the process. So change management has always been really important to me. And what we are trying to do at the moment, and I had the privilege of being allowed onto the doctoral program at the University of Cape Town, the Graduate School of Business, is we are trying to have a look at, if we think about the ways in which people support a change, right? So typically, in an environment where we engage in a plan change, and very often, and you'll know with many of the clients that you work with as well, change is often planned, right? So we now need to adopt a new strategy, or implement a new technology, or there's something that needs to be done, and then we work out this plan change intervention. Has a start and an end date, and a huge budget assigned to it, and unfortunately, what the current research tells us is that as many as 1 in 3 of those large interventions fail dismally, and more importantly, almost 45% of the value of this intervention gets lost even before implementation starts. So it is significant. It is significant, yeah. So a lot of work is being done to try and find out, now, what can we do to make these change interventions more successful? So there's a lot of work that has been done in the past to start thinking about what is being referred to as the deeper structures underneath, or that underlie change management. So instead of just looking at the standard change process of formulating the change, communicating the change, and then training people to be able to implement what is being changed, and then following on in terms of whether it's being done correctly. Now, what is underneath that? Because obviously that in itself seems and sounds very simple, but it doesn't seem to do the job. And I think what we started to discover is something that I think at KnowledgeWorks and with ICI we ran across many years ago, and that is that people look at the world in different ways, right? So people have different views of the world. So when I run this straightforward change process in a specific context, I need to understand what are some of these deep worldview structures of those individuals involved in the change process. And that's what we are working on at the moment. So it's not so much changing, evidence-based practice as far as change management is concerned. A recent study that was done in 2019, identified a significant amount of really well-designed best practices that really do work, right? But unfortunately, they don't work always, and they don't work everywhere. So what we are hoping to do is by shining the spotlight of cultural worldview over the whole change management process, is to identify whether one of these deep structures, and worldview has been identified as one of those deep structures, whether that influences the way people change, and whether it's something that, if we keep it into account, we can use to help people change more successfully. And that really is the foundation of my study.
And it's an opportune time as well, because if you look at the amount of change that humanity has to go through right now, it has escalated or evolved rapidly. So it's exciting. I look forward to seeing the results of that flow into the world around us.
Thank you.
It's been really good to go back into history a bit with you, George. There's so much to talk about, but also time is always with us. So in closing, of course, you talk about change management, a significant part of consulting practice. Change management is almost always part of any consulting initiative in some way or another. But if you were to summarize what you think a globally functioning consultant in today's world, what would you say to them? What do they need? What should they pursue in terms of personal development, in terms of how they can be better at doing their job in a global, interculturally complex world?
Right. Marco, I would refer back to an old model, I think that you and I spoke about very often in the past, where we talked about handset and heart set and mindset, right? And I think if I had to advise, and I do, even now when I work with other consultants, or in the past when I was training consultants, I often said to them, it starts with what is in your heart, right? So it's really about looking forward and asking yourself, why am I a consultant? Or what am I trying to achieve, both for myself in my career, but also for my clients, in executing my career. What am I trying, and to what, right? So if I as a consultant are engaging in this career as someone that wants to help others change positively, then I'm on the right track, right? So having the right heart set. Secondly, having the right mindset. And I think from a mindset point of view, I talk about being able to put yourself in the shoes of your client, and really using a very old definition of what we were working with in the past, really being able to identify what your client is all about, being able to interpret what you see correctly, and then being able to adapt to what you see. That needs to be your mindset, right? So I'm doing this because I really want to help my client. And the way in which I'm going to help my client is really understand my client, to interpret what I believe I understand correctly, and then to adjust accordingly, right? And then lastly, when we talk about handset, now handset to me is methodology. So, one can be, go into this consulting career with the best intentions, right? With a willingness to be agile. But if you do not have methodology, then you know better than a second-hand car salesman that's down the street. You do need to understand the methodology. So I would recommend that if you want to grow as an intercultural consultant, don't just say, well, we need to understand the people and then that'll solve all the problems. You need to understand methodology. Methodology, unfortunately, is published in the top journals. So you need to read those journals. Sometimes they're difficult to read because they are written in highly academic language, but they've got some really important nuggets that I hope through our practice at the University of Cape Town and at other very important schools, we will in the future be able to make a lot more digestible. But with that methodology and overlaid on top of that, a mindset of wanting to help clients through understanding where they're coming from, understanding their worldviews, etc., and then having the right heart. I want to help them to improve. I think you can't go wrong. The rest is in the Big Four training manuals already, so I'm not going to go into all of that. But those are, in my mind, the 3 secrets to success.
Heart set, mindset, and skill set.
Absolutely.
I think that pushes us beyond just method and professionalism into a bit of artistry as well.
Indeed.
As you're explaining it, I'm thinking of a painter's palette.
Indeed.
Painting some beautiful work there.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, George. Anybody who wants to connect with George directly, as always with our podcasts, his contact details are in the notes of this recording. So feel free to reach out to George and start a conversation with him. He's part of our global network, one of our partners, and he will love to take this conversation further with you.
Absolutely.
And thank you, George, for joining during this session.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Marco. It's lovely to chat to you.
If you've listened to this podcast before, you may have heard us talk about the Intercultural Intelligence Certification Program. It's an amazing 15-week journey, and the next one launches in September. You will join a small cohort for weekly sessions and learn to use tools like the 3 colors of worldview and the cultural mapping inventory. After finishing, you will join our network of over 600 practitioners in 70 countries to equip the world with cultural agility. To sign up, look for the link in the show notes, and I really hope you can join us in September. Now, you thought we were done. We're not done yet. George has agreed to some rapid-fire questions. So get to know George a little bit better in the next just 10 minutes or so. We'll have 8 questions, so it might be quicker than 10 minutes. But some quick questions. Keep it short, George.
Mm-hmm.
Quick answers, short answers. You ready?
I'm ready.
So what's your favorite thing to do to recharge?
Oh, man, I love to walk my dogs on the beach, especially now living in Simonstown, and there's nothing more rewarding to do.
That's great. Who is the most inspirational person in your life?
Other than you, Marco? No. I would think probably, um, and it's a bit of a cliche sometimes, especially for the African, but somebody like Nelson Mandela is really somebody that has stirred me. So there are many inspirational people in my life. I can think of my good wife Sandra, who really is always next to me. But in terms of, in the broader sense, somebody like Nelson Mandela, somebody like Desmond Tutu, who passed recently very sadly, who really, could step out there and show others what intercultural intelligence really looks like. Not just talk about it, but really, put the rubber to the road, as you say.
Yeah. What's one of the most interesting places you've visited?
Okay. Yeah. Actually, I've been to, and I had the privilege of going to Antarctica, and it's
Antarctica.
Antarctica, yeah, and it's a really good place to see intercultural intelligence in play. And you think, well, there's nobody there, but if you look at Antarctica, you think it's white, right? But actually, it is a million different shades of gray. It is amazing in terms of the different sediment in the ice, and it just makes me think of us as people. It's just such a beautiful tapestry of differences, but actually very very similar. Colors that actually comes together, something that's really beautiful, right?
Fascinating. What are you currently reading?
Oh, I'm reading 110 academic papers at the moment.
Well, that's not really inspirational for me, at least.
No, I understand.
But let's say a book that you think, I'm happy I picked up that book.
Yeah, no, actually, it's a book that I'm rereading at the moment. In fact, and I think it's here in the back of my wall, if I can find it. But it's a text on leadership within the military, and it's called "It's Your Ship." So I think you've maybe seen it. So it's life lessons from the best damn ship in the Navy. It's called, and what the guy is really talking about is taking ownership of what it is that you are responsible for, and how do you lead that process of taking ownership and also inspiring others to take ownership of what we in the Navy would call in the past your part of ship. So yeah, It's Your Ship, the story of the best damn ship in the Navy, I think it's called. Yeah, I can definitely recommend that one.
Brilliant. Now, something totally different. So if you were to change your career to become a professional athlete,
right,
what sport would you choose?
Wow. I've always been interested in martial arts, and I would definitely become would like to become one of the best Aikido players in the world.
Aikido.
Yeah. And you know what, Marco? I think, other than the fact that it's a very beautiful sport, what is amazing to me is if one really takes some of those kata and practices and really perfects them, how effortless it is, right, to use both your own energy and the energy of your opponent to achieve some objective, right? So the whole idea of Aikido is not really to use your own strength, but to use the weight and the movement, the velocity, whatever of your opponent in order to achieve whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, right? And that really fascinates me, is how do we that fluid movement, almost a Tai Chi type of flow between two people. It's amazing, yeah. So that really stirs me.
It's beautiful to watch. Absolutely.
It is.
What's your favorite food?
Oh, Marco, you know that, right? I think unfortunately, and I apologize to the vegans out there, I'm a red meat enthusiast, and especially a good piece of steak. My wife is trying to get me off that, but I'm afraid she's failing in that one.
Nothing like a good South African braai.
Absolutely.
Now, I asked you about professional sports, but when you think about if you had the chance to start over and do something totally different, what path would you choose? What would it look like?
If I had to start over, Marco, my name George, it means farmer, and I do believe there is value in one's, and lots of meaning in that. So I've often thought it would be nice to be a farmer, right? I don't know whether I'll be a farmer in the full sense of the word, but something like a gentleman farmer in the old days, so I could do a little bit of consulting on the side. But yeah, having a little piece of land, maybe here on the in the south coast of Cape Town, and having a few head of cattle, that would be quite rewarding. And I think the whole idea of just taking something that that God has given us and just stewarding that, as I think we should with our relationships with people in the business context. I think that's just something that stirs me, and it suits my name, right?
Wonderful. Well, I'm glad we added these few minutes to get to know you a little bit better. Thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it. And
it's my pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode. See you again next time.
Right then. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Cultural Agility Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with someone. The best way to help us out is by leaving a review on your favorite podcast app or channel, or forward and recommend this podcast to people around you. As always, if any of the topics we discussed today intrigue you, you will find links to articles discussing them in greater depth in the podcast notes. If you would like to learn more about intercultural intelligence and how you can become more culturally agile, you can find more information and hundreds of articles at knowledgeworks.com. A special thanks to Jason Carter for composing the music on this podcast, and to the whole KnowledgeWorks team for making this podcast a success. Thank you, Nita Rodriguez, Ara Azizbekian, Rajitha Raj, and thanks to Vip and George for audio production, Rosalind Raj for scheduling, and Caleb Strauss for marketing and helping produce this podcast.